Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And today, I want to talk about another iconic franchise, the Terminator. I know it's one I've talked about before in a previous video, and in that same video, I made it clear that I'm a big Terminator fan. But, as much as I love this franchise, I can't deny that it has fallen on hard times. It's just a sad fact of life. Some franchises just aren't built to last. Much to the chagrin of many major movie studios, not every franchise can be like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Most just don't have the resources or the narrative to grow to that level. But with the Terminator, I think it's safe to say that it has failed in its efforts to remain relevant. And believe me, I take no pleasure in saying that. You see, I've always had a special place in my heart for all things Terminator. The original 1984 film was one of the first R-rated movies that my parents let me watch. I still vividly remember being so scared when I saw it, but thrilled at the same time. And as a kid, that was a major step up from traditional Disney movies. Then I saw Terminator 2 Judgment Day, and the highest of bars was set. Like the first movie, it thrilled and amazed me to no end. At the same time, it struck so many emotional chords, especially at the end. To this day, I still get choked up whenever I hear the T-800 tell John, "I know now why you cry, but it's something I can never do." Because of moments like that, this movie often ranks among the greatest of all time. And I still contend it is the single greatest action movie of all time. And a big part of what made that movie so great was how it completed the story. What began with Sarah Connors in the first film ended beautifully with her and John in the second. It was as complete a story as it could have been. And therein lies the problem that hindered every subsequent sequel. Because to make a sequel after Terminator 2 is like trying to improve on the Mona Lisa. While the prospect of sequels still interested me, I never got the sense that they could improve on what the first two movies did. That still didn't stop Hollywood from trying multiple times with multiple actors and directors. And while some of those movies had their moments, they just never came close to improving on the first two. If anything, each sequel did more and more to undermine those first two movies. And finally, with Terminator Dark Fate being an outright flop, the state of this franchise is at a new low. Many are already saying it's dead, but I don't agree with that. I certainly don't deny that it's in critical condition, but that being said, I don't think it's doomed to the archives of cinematic history. I believe it's worth taking a step back to understand why the franchise has faltered so badly, and I also believe there is a way to revive it for a whole new generation. Now, the reasons why the franchise has declined so much are many. They usually boil down to reasons like this. The ending of Terminator 2 Judgment Day was just too perfect to improve upon. Or the sequels focused too much on action and not enough on the horror of the first movie or the heart of the second. Or the sequels just didn't utilize enough of the original cast, relying far too heavily on the star power of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Or the sequels were too focused on setting up a new trilogy rather than making one solid movie. Or the threats in the sequels were just too bland and predictable, often devolving into newer Terminators fighting older Terminators. For me personally, I think every one of these reasons has merit, but I think some have more than others. When I go back and rewatch Terminator 2 Judgment Day and compare it to the sequels, I can clearly see the difference from a storytelling standpoint. That movie was made to complete the story that James Cameron began with the first. It never attempted to set up a sequel. It just focused on being a great movie, and it succeeded on every level. Contrast that with the sequels. The focus of those movies was less about having a genuine impact and more about teasing future movies. But that only works if the first movie is successful, and that didn't happen with any of the sequels after Terminator 2 Judgment Day. Those movies just tried too hard to set up a larger story, but by the end, nobody really cared about that story. Eventually, I feel like the studios got too bold. And with Terminator Dark Fate, it just went too far. Because what this movie did to John Connors just cannot be overlooked. It's so bad that I won't even bother with a spoiler warning. Terminator Dark Fate kills John within the first 2 minutes of the movie. In one cold, callous sequence, this character who fought so hard with his mother to save the future is just shot dead. And on top of that, neither he nor his mother made a difference in the grand scheme of things. The only thing they changed was the name of our future robot overlords. Instead of Skynet, they got Legion. That's really it. That's all that changed with everything they fought for and sacrificed. Then, that same movie tries to tell a story about a new savior, Danny, a character who nobody has any attachments to and will always be defined as being John Connor's replacement. It doesn't even matter how nice, likable, or capable she is. She'll still always be the one who took John's place and followed the same general path. And as a Terminator fan, it's hard to see the appeal. In addition to all that, Terminator Dark Fate went heavy into mixing questionable gender politics with the movie. And that's not just some skewed interpretation from a bunch of internet trolls. The director himself, Tim Miller, flat out admitted it in interviews before the movie came out. And naturally, that did not become a major selling point. Now, I don't want to get too caught up in that aspect of the movie. The internet is toxic enough without more discussions about gender politics and pop culture. But even I think that was a contributing factor in the movie's shortcomings. There are still plenty of other flaws to highlight in Terminator Dark Fate, as well as plenty more in the movies that came before it. So, rather than belabor those issues, I want to focus on how this franchise rebuilds from here. There's no doubt that the failures of so many sequels has damaged the franchise significantly. There's no amount of time travel or retroactive changes that can save the story that Terminator Dark Fate tried to set up. But, that being said, I do think this franchise has a few things going for it. Most notably, it's a known brand that people recognize. When someone hears the word Terminator, they usually understand it as a reference to the movies. Even if it's not as strong a brand as it used to be, that still carries weight. And sometimes, that's all you need to get a franchise going again. And I think that's all the Terminator needs to get back on track. But I think the first step in that daunting process involves ending the futile effort to somehow improve on the story of Sarah and John Connor. Like it or not, their story just ended too perfectly in Terminator 2 Judgment Day. And most Terminator fans agree with that. Anything that would undermine their legacy is not a viable path forward. I also think another critical step is to start an entirely new timeline. One with no John Connor, no Sarah Connor, and no Kyle Reese. Again, I know that sounds daunting, but again, we cannot and should not improve on that story. The only thing the franchise really needs to keep are Skynet and the Terminators. That must be the only constant. But in terms of the overall story, this new timeline just cannot focus on saving the future leader of the Resistance or stopping Judgment Day. For the Terminator to succeed as a franchise, it needs to show that it can do more. And to that end, I think that both Terminator Dark Fate and Terminator Genisys offers the key to this franchise's renewal and survival. In Dark Fate, the Terminator that killed John, again played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, secretly built a life for itself after its mission was complete. It walked around as a human named Carl, met a woman with a son from a previous marriage, and formed a family. If that movie had any plot worthy of intrigue, it was that. But sadly, it was poorly developed and mostly rendered pointless in the end. Terminator Genisys did something similar. In that movie, another T-800 played by Arnold Schwarzenegger went back and rescued Sarah when she was just a girl. And from there, he became a surrogate father figure, who she called Pops. He even showed signs of growing to love Sarah like a daughter. The relationship they had was probably the closest the franchise ever came to duplicating what John had with the Terminator in Judgment Day. It took this cold, hard killing machine and gave it real feelings and emotions. that gave every action and choice they made throughout the story a lot more weight. It's a concept that might actually resonate more today than it did back in 1984. You see, when the first Terminator movie came out, machines and robots really weren't that smart. They were often defined by how inhuman, cold, and calculating they were. But in recent years, that has changed a great deal. Movies like Ex Machina and WALL-E have built compelling stories about robots that have human traits, including real, powerful emotions. And I still believe that if Terminator Genisys had focused on this, and not made John Connor evil, that movie would have succeeded. And we never would have gotten a movie like Dark Fate in the first place. Instead, we could have gotten an action-packed tale of a Terminator rebelling against its own programming, torn between preserving Skynet and saving the family he'd found with Sarah and Kyle. That could have been really powerful. We may never know what could have been. But, at the very least, both those movies give the franchise a viable concept to work with. I believe a future Terminator movie or TV series should go all in on this idea. Having this killing machine develop strong emotional attachments to humans. Again, this is something that's a lot more relevant today than it was in 1984 or 1991. We already interact more intimately with technology than ever before. We're already at a point where we're giving our technology a real personality. I say that's a story that the Terminator can build upon. So, with that in mind, imagine the following scenario. In the distant future, machines have taken over. They fought a war against their human creators and triumphed. Most of the human population has been killed. Most of those that remain have been enslaved. There are still small pockets of resistance, but they refuse to succumb to their fate. So, to combat this, the Central Machine Intelligence, Skynet, creates Terminators with the sole purpose of killing the remaining humans. But humans still prove crafty. They find ways to outwit and outsmart the early models. The attacks even prompt humans to become more organized, making future attacks more difficult. It soon gets to a point where traditional methods of attack are too inefficient, as well as a drain on Skynet's resources. That drain only compounds over time. Each failed model of the Terminator, the human resistance becomes more tenacious. Skynet eventually calculates that its current approach is unsustainable and could result in either destruction or stagnation. So, in order to create the ultimate Terminator, new models are created that can mimic, study, and process human emotions. Ideally, they would be able to infiltrate human resistance camps, earn their trust, and terminate them appropriately. Skynet calculates that, with proper refinement, they could effectively end the resistance. Unfortunately, there isn't enough data to adequately program these models. Humans are just too scattered, stubborn, and desperate. Skynet also calculates that it would take too long and require too many resources to compile the data in the present. As a result, it decides to send a model prototype back in time before the machines took over. The act does require vast amounts of energy, which would make Skynet vulnerable for a time, but the potential rewards, creating the ultimate killing machine, are deemed acceptable risks. The model they sent back had a simple mission: integrate into human society, compile data, preserve it, and transmit it back to Skynet in the form of special data disks. And if its identity is ever uncovered by a human, its primary protocol is to terminate the human. And at no point is it to compromise the rise of Skynet. The first prototype model is sent back. It arrives in a bustling city that would one day be reduced to ruin. It finds clothes, creates an identity, and begins integration. However, just as it's starting to establish itself, a human finds out it's a machine. As a result, its termination protocols are activated. But then, something unexpected happens. it doesn't kill the human. Instead of fear, the human develops intrigue. It connects with the Terminator, and they start to form a bond. Eventually, the Terminator's systems for mimicking emotions turn into real emotions, and it develops a love for humanity and decides to defy Skynet. That decision ultimately ripples into the future, and as a result, Skynet tries to send other Terminators back to destroy it. As a longtime Terminator fan, I would love to see a movie or a TV series built around a story like this. I think it could work with a male or female Terminator. It could also work with a male or female protagonist. Like the T-800 in Terminator Dark Fate and Genesis, it could become part of a family, giving it something to fight for and to protect. And instead of fighting to protect a future savior, the Terminator fights to change the fate of both itself and humanity. But this is just my idea. I'd love to hear what other Terminator fans think. I'd also love to hear how they would go about revitalizing this franchise. Because I believe there is room for it in the current cultural landscape. And as machines and advanced artificial intelligence continue to progress, I suspect it will even become more relevant. Like Sarah Connor once said, "There is no fate but what we make for ourselves." That applies to our future as a species, just as much as it applies to the Terminator franchise. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, preferably before Judgment Day. Take care and stay safe.